Okay, so this is going to be very much work in progress. We're working on this as we speak. What I'm going to show you is stuff that's not yet been finally agreed, but I thought you would be interested in it. And I even have a small demonstration to show you later on. But first of all, let's get back to the actual presentation. So, what's our objective in this project? So really, it's to align the use of ledgers in Mojaloop with current international accounting standards. I think it's fair to say that the chart of accounts that we currently have in Mojaloop was created with significant input from developers and without very much input from accountants, and particularly not from accounting experts. And we've certainly had questions in the past about how our accounts are organized and complaints that professional accountants find it quite difficult to understand what's happening. So we want to make sure that the way in which Mojaloop represents things align with current international accounting standards, and also that they are represented in the switch in a form which accountants can easily understand and make sense of. So those are our objectives. I want to start with some fundamental accounting principles, which were taught to me with a bat by Miller. First of all, there's no such thing as negative money. All the values are positive. Second, the difference between positive and negative is that accounts are either assets or liabilities. And that depends on your point of view. One person's asset is another person's liability in the system. Now, when money is moving, you need to credit the source and debit the receiver. Debits rise on the left side, credits rise on the right side. If I debit an asset account, I increase its value. If I credit a liability account, I increase its value. And crediting an asset account reduces its value. And the fundamental principle is that assets must equal liabilities across the whole system at all times. So everything needs to balance in the end. Now, we think that Mojaloop needs to account for the following things. First of all, funds under management. These are what we currently loosely refer to as liquidity cover. So they are funds which have been deposited by DFSPs somewhere to cover, to guarantee that they can meet their settlement obligations. So we need to account for those. We also need to account for funds which are reserved by the system to cover expected obligations. Now, you'll know that when we do the liquidity check, after a payment request passes the liquidity check, those funds are reserved. They're kept separate so that they can't be spent twice. So that essentially all the liquidity cover can only be spent once. We need to account for those funds and to make sure that people can understand where they are. Third, we need to account for obligations which have been incurred in the process of payment, which have not yet been settled. So these are things where payments have been completed, obligations have been created, party A owes this amount, party B is owed that amount. But those funds have not yet been settled. They are obligations that will be settled. Then we have to account for funds which are settled between participants as a consequence of those obligations. And we also need to make sure that we can cover reservations made by participants against their liquidity cover, which effectively restrict the amount of cover which the system is allowed to use. Now, in accounting terms, we're going to say each participant has an account. The categories that we report, the categories that we've just been talking about, are sub-accounts of this account. And the sub-accounts are either liabilities or assets. And you remember I said that they would be liabilities or assets considered from the point of view of the scheme. Now, looking at the categories, sub-accounts in that context, we go first to liabilities. And we have a deposit account, which, again, the names of these accounts are subject to discussion. They will probably not be called this eventually. This is a working title for the account. Deposit account represents the funds which the DFSP has committed for liquidity support. And it's a liability because eventually the Mojaloop scheme will need to repay the funds in this account. Second, there's the outgoing committed funds. Now that represents obligations from another DFSP, which have been recorded by a DFSP as a consequence of completed payments, i.e., there are things that where this DFSP is the beneficiary, and they're a liability because eventually, again, the Mojaloop scheme will need to pay those funds out eventually. We finally have what we're calling a pre-settlement deposit account, and that represents pending obligations which will be paid in settlement. That's a liability because we will disburse them in the process of settlement. So those are the liabilities. Let me now look at the assets. And we have unrestricted funds. And those are funds which, sorry, I'm just picking up a question from Steve. No, we don't only care about the net debit cap. So the difference here, Steve, I'll talk about this in a bit, but I will talk about it now because it's important. The process of recording deposits is a complicated one because the scheme needs to satisfy itself that those funds really are present and that they really are available to the scheme, and that, for instance, the participant can't remove those funds without the scheme knowing about it. So that's quite a complicated and long-running process. On the other hand, as we know, RTGSs, which are how things are actually settled, typically don't work at the weekends, sometimes don't work in public holidays, don't work overnight. And therefore, it may be that to cover those long periods when settlement can't take place, a DFSP has to have additional cover on hand to use to cover its activities while settlement can't take place. However, one of the things that the very early participants in Mojaloop schemes said to us was, we don't want to use all of that. In the ordinary weekday, we only want to use a proportion of that because we don't need more than a certain amount of it. But what we want is a simple way of moving that counter so we could make more funds available when we wanted to, or less funds available when we wanted to, without having to go through the more complicated process of actually depositing funds and making sure those deposits were registered. So that's the reason why we're making a difference between the net debit cap, which is something which a participant can vary at their request. Sorry, they don't even need to ask anyone, they can just do it. And deposit, funds on deposit, good funds under management, where the scheme needs to satisfy itself that those funds really are available, and which is therefore a more protracted process. So that's the reason for the differences between those. Now, unrestricted funds are the funds which the DFSP says may be used to support its activities. So those are effectively the funds in the net debit cap. They can be moved back and forth at any point. And it's an asset because the Mojaloop scheme uses those funds to support payment activity. Second, there are restricted funds. And the restricted funds are the difference between the funds on deposit and the unrestricted funds, effectively. It's funds which have been deposited, but which the DFSP has said you can't use those to fund my transaction activities. Reserved funds represent funds which the Mojaloop scheme has reserved to cover expected liabilities. Effectively, those are transfers in flight, payments in flight. It's an asset because we're using those to support payment activity. And finally, there are committed funds incoming, and those represent funds which the scheme will get because the DFSP owes them to another DFSP as a consequence of completed payments. It's an asset because the Mojaloop scheme will get them in the process of settlement. So those are the 7 sub-accounts that we are currently working with. Now, there are 2 aspects that we need to, 2 additional aspects that we need to think about. I've talked about one of them a bit already, but I will just talk a little bit more about it. The net debit cap allows a participant to say, I only want you to use this amount of my total deposits to fund my transfer activity. And in this context, it's important to notice that transfer activity means obligations which have been incurred but have not yet been settled. So once an obligation has been settled, it no longer counts in the net debit cap. Second, there's the question of working capital reduction. Now, this is something which happens at the moment in any case in the Mojaloop system. What we say at the moment is when a payment is complete, the payee DFSP, the DFSP which was the creditor in that payment, can make use of those funds to fund its activities. So it gets a direct credit for that against its position. We took the view when we were looking at the accounting side of things that that was something that schemes might decide to do or not to do. They might want to say DFSPs can use those funds immediately because liquidity cover means that everybody can be confident that they will eventually get them and they can use them straight away. Or the scheme might want to say, no, they can't use them until the process of settlement happens and those funds are actually available to them to use. So we need to take into account in our accounting both of those 2 parts of account configuration. And we are proceeding with the assumption that both of those things can be set or not set at the participant level. They don't have to be set at the scheme level necessarily, though they might be. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the accounting steps of a payment, and just look at how we're modeling this. So let's take a first action where a DFSP registers liquidity cover, provides funds to be used as cover, and in the example, the DFSP deposits £1,000 and it has a net debit cap of £750. Now, what that means is that the unrestricted funds for the amount of the NDC are debited and the deposit account is credited by that amount. And the restricted funds, i.e. the balance of the deposit, which can't be used, are debited from the restricted funds account and credited to the deposit account. So in this case, although there's one deposit, there are 2 accounting entries, one of which is to the unrestricted funds account and the other of which is to the restricted funds account, totaling in the whole thing the full amount of the deposit. Now, I'm not going to go through the other examples, the other steps, though we are working on detailed representations of each of the steps and what those mean in terms of movements of the accounts. First of all, to make sure that we can understand it, that I can understand it. Of course, Miller and Robert, who's our accounting consultant, understand all this stuff already, but it takes me a little while. And second of all, to make sure that we can properly represent it to people and they can understand what it means. Now, I promised you a demonstration, and I've been working. Sorry, let me stop sharing here. and start sharing something else. So I've been working on a simulator. It's an Excel-based simulator. And essentially what it does is it allows us to model the accounting movements related to the new accounting model. Just to go through the tabs, there's a tab which is marked participants. Actually, why don't I just turn that off for the moment? So there's a tab with participants, and that has participants, whether or not they have a net debit cap, and whether or not each participant has working capital reduction in place. Then there's an activity tab, and that will hold the transfers which are generated as part of the simulation. We have a settlement batches tab, and the settlement batches are essentially done by number of transfers. That's just to keep things simple and to make sure we get a number of settlement batches in. And then we have, for each participant, they have a tab which has actions and the effect of those actions on each of their accounts, as we've just seen them, one for participant A and one for participant B. So now let's have a look at how this might work. The first thing I need to do is I need to set a maximum transfer size, and that will cover the random amount. Now I will do that deposit that we just saw on the slide. When I make the deposit this way, you will see, oh, that's nice, everything is bold. Sorry about that. But you will see that we've got two actions, as you would expect. First of all, second of all, the deposit is restricted. Sorry, the remainder of the deposit is restricted. Funds are deposited up to the net debit cap. So the balance of the deposit is now $1,000 or X's or UDX's, whatever they are. But that's broken out into a transfer for 250 to the restricted assets account and a transfer of 750 to the unrestricted assets account. So that is kind of what we would have hoped to see. We'll go and do a similar one for participant B. And we'll see down here that that's resulted, because the net debit cap was 500, in a balance of 500 in the unrestricted funds and 500 in the restricted funds. So now we can just let it run. We'll do that, and we'll see it's running through, and then at some point we will get a message up to say we've had a problem because we've run out of liquidity. This will now have stopped, and we can now, well, what I'll just do first is I will say we can settle. So if I press the settle button, we will see, sorry about that. That's what happens when you do demonstrations. Okay, I will quit from here, and we can see what's happening. Oh, that's interesting. So the activity, okay, there's a problem there. But each of the transfers has a transfer ID, it's got a settlement batch, a payer and a payee, and an amount and a status. So what we can do is we can either rerun this list, or alternatively, we can put in individual transfers if we want to model a particular case. Believe me, I had a settlement working earlier on. Clearly it stopped. But what I can do now is if I go back, let me go back to participant A and start running again. I can now do another deposit, 1,000. And we should be able to carry on, I hope. Oh, sorry about that. No, it didn't work. Oh, I know why. Yeah, sorry. Anyway, so that is what I'm currently working on. The idea being that we should be able to do some detailed modeling of how all this works and will look in practice in terms of the accounts. And that is all I have to say.